speaker is Rei Hagimoto, and he's going to tell us about quantum dynamics of a qubit coupled to an oscillator.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So I've been working with Dr. Van Hula and Dr. Brondo on a project investigating the quantum dynamics of a qubit coupled to an oscillator. But before I discuss what I've been doing for the past 10 weeks, I'd like to introduce my topic from the beginning by describing what quantum dynamics, qubits, and oscillators are. So quantum dynamics is a term that refers to the study of the time evolution of quantum mechanical systems under some form of influence. So, for example, an example of a dynamic system in quantum mechanics is a forced harmonic oscillator. For the purposes of this presentation, the most relevant physical model used for the quantum harmonic oscillator is going to be electromagnetic cavities, which I think of as a box filled with oscillating electromagnetic fields, so in other words, light. But it is important to keep in mind that the harmonic oscillator is a useful model that can represent a really wide range of physical systems. So, qubits, on the other hand, are the most basic unit of quantum information, and they can be modeled as any two-level quantum mechanical system. So as examples of that, you can use an electron spin states to form a two-level system, or you could use an atom with just two energy levels. In this presentation, I use the spin diagram to just represent my qubit because it's pretty, but the most useful representation to think about is going to be the energy level description. But it's important to keep in mind that both the qubit and oscillator systems are very general, and what I'm studying is some kind of interaction between them and evolving that in time. So it allows us to study a very general, broad range of physical phenomena by only having to study a single family of models, which is very powerful. And obviously, if we're studying qubits, there's a connection with quantum information theory, so that could have implications in quantum computing as well. So, I've been talking a lot about coupling systems and having them interact, and I think it's good to have a conceptual understanding of what this might mean. So one way of thinking about it is we take our box, and then inside of that box we put a qubit, and because they're now overlapping, there's the opportunity for them to interact with each other. One type of interaction you might consider would be, let's say that you put a qubit inside the box in its ground state, and then because this box is filled with photons, if the photon has enough energy, it could be absorbed by the qubit, and then that might raise the qubit's energy level. That's a potential type of interaction that could occur, but it just gives us something to think about. So what's useful is we have a conceptual understanding, and now we need to pair this with a mathematical understanding of it, so that we can do calculations and look at things analytically. Okay. What the tool that we need to use to understand this is looking at Hamiltonians. So a Hamiltonian is something that's known as the generator of time evolutions of a physical system. So because I'm studying time evolutions of a system, we need to have a Hamiltonian to look at it mathematically. Last time I looked at the Hamiltonian of a forced harmonic oscillator, which is probably the toy model that we considered in this case. And what I said last time was I wanted to compare this, extend this to something more complicated. So the forced harmonic oscillator simply has a harmonic oscillator term and the forcing term, whereas the system that I was interested in studying was the Rabi interaction, which is what is really describing a qubit interacting with an oscillator. And this Hamiltonian has a very similar structure in that it has a harmonic oscillator term, it adds a qubit term, which you'd expect because the other one didn't have a qubit, but then the third term looks quite similar to the forcing term from the harmonic oscillator, with the forced harmonic oscillator, because this lambda of t acting on this a plus a dagger looks very much like the forcing term in that other Hamiltonian. This lambda of t is really a measurement of how strong the interaction is between the qubit and the oscillator at a given time. And so we can think of it as the interaction strength, and that will be useful. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is that having this omega and omega naught being the same valued frequencies would give both the energy differences for the harmonic oscillator and qubit the same energy gaps, and we call that case the resonance case. The reason we care about the resonance case is because it's just a model that is useful to study, and it's also has exact solutions available for it. The names given to the resonance case of the Rabi interaction is the James-Cummings model, and its Hamiltonian is basically the same as the Rabi interaction, with the first two terms being the same. The only difference is that its interaction looks a little bit different because it limits the types of interactions available. But it's essentially, it is exactly the same system when you're looking at it from the resonance case. So, I've defined my Hamiltonians, and now I need to start asking questions about what it is I'm looking at when I'm evolving things in time. One question you could ask is, what state is the qubit in at any particular time? And the way that you can visualize this is the qubit, if I measure it now, would I get it in the ground state or the excited state, and with what probability? The way that you do that is by taking an expectation value of the operator that tells you which state it's in. So I had to give it some initial conditions for which state to evolve in time. So I just decided that I wanted my harmonic oscillator to be in a number state, and then number states are just the energy eigenstates of the simple harmonic oscillator Hamiltonian. And then I made sure that the qubit was in the excited state initially, and I evolved that with time. What I got was an expression which I found by using one of our grad students' Mathematica programs. I got an expression in Mathematica, and then I was able to manipulate that by hand to get this result. And when I plotted this for a particular value of an interaction strength, lambda being 1, and a number of photons in the box being 5, I got a graph that was just a sinusoidal oscillation. And if we interpret this physically, what's important to notice is that the expectation value of the sigma z operator, which is the one that tells you where your qubit is, which state your qubit's in, if the value is 1, it's in the excited state. If it's -1, it's in the ground state. So we see that it starts at the excited state, and it somehow passes through some kind of superposition states, gets to the ground state, and then it goes back up. I wanted to make a parallel of this with the Bohr model of the atom, where most of us are familiar with atomic emission and absorption spectra, where for an electron to be excited, it has to transfer from one energy level to the other, but it doesn't actually go through anything in between. And that's what Bohr said. This kind of shows that there's a little bit more going on in the background than just some kind of mystical teleportation in a quantum leap. It does transfer, there is some kind of transition through superposition states. But if you were to measure it at any time in between, you would still only measure ground or excited. The next thing I looked at is giving it a different initial condition, but for the same constant lambda and for the same number of photons in the box. I just made sure that instead of the harmonic oscillator being in a number state, I gave it a coherent state. Again, I did some work in Mathematica and some work by hand, and I got a different expression completely. And this one has a lot of different frequencies, or cosine graphs with different frequencies interacting with each other. And the graph that we get is completely different. So I've changed almost nothing about the system, except for the initial condition that I gave it, and the type of evolution that I got was completely different. So it starts off in the excited state, as I did last time, but it never actually gets to be completely in the ground state. It never reaches a value of -1. It sort of just kills itself at this time, and then there's a revival, which looks a little bit like a heartbeat, and then it looks like this would, well, not heartbeat, but some kind of beat, and it looks like this kind of continues, but it's not exactly periodic or anything. What's really going on is we've introduced a lot of different frequencies of cosine graphs interacting with each other, and that's why we have such different behavior. But it's just, what was interesting was that we gave it the same number of photons in the box and the same interaction constant strength, and we got a completely different result. So, in summary, we just found that, at least in this presentation, what I showed is that number and coherent states would have evolved very differently in time. And what we want to do in the future is be able to look at different lambdas. So for different interaction strengths that depend on time, how would the system evolve? One thing that we could consider is if you take the qubit in the box, it turns out that where that qubit is changes the interaction strength. So as you move the qubit in the box, your lambda would be changing in time, and you could model that with like a sinusoidal oscillation or something like that, which would be interesting to look at. So that is some future work. I'd like to recognize the National Science Foundation and thank them for funding me being out here this summer, as well as Arizona State University and WASO for giving me an extra boost. And obviously I want to thank everyone who I stayed with, and give special thanks to a very special someone who has been my light and inspiration throughout this entire